Title: It's Impossible to Explain. The Heartbreaking Case of Rhonda Casto ***. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. Rhonda Casto sat at her kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead bulb flickering in the silence. She could hear the clock ticking, a slow, deliberate sound that felt too loud. Her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, but the warmth she expected never came. It was as if the mug itself had been drained of all comfort. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. But inside, Rhonda felt frozen. A chill that wasn't from the cold crept over her. The house was too still, too quiet. Then she heard it, a soft scraping sound, barely audible at first. Her heart skipped a beat. Was someone outside? Her eyes darted around the room, seeking some kind of reassurance. But there was nothing, just shadows. Suddenly, the scraping grew louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway. Her breath hitched. She stood up, her knees weak. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved cautiously toward the sound. Each step felt heavier, like she was walking through mud. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and endless. As she approached the source of the noise, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. There at the end of the hallway was something out of place. A door ajar. The scraping sound stopped. A sharp, eerie silence filled the air. Rhonda's pulse quickened. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run. But she couldn't move. She reached for the doorknob. The cold metal burned her skin. With a deep breath, she pulled the door open. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. The room was untouched, but everything felt wrong. And there on the floor was a note. It was simple, handwritten in dark ink. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't explain. Rhonda dropped to her knees, her mind racing. She had no idea who left it or what it meant. But the chill in the air deepened, and she knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The horror wasn't in the note. It was in the fact that Rhonda had never written it. The words on the note burned into her mind, but they weren't hers. Her hands shook as she picked it up, reading the same sentence over and over, trying to make sense of it. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't explain. Who had written it? Why?" She scanned the room once more, but everything remained eerily still. Her breath grew shallow, her chest tightening with dread. Then, a sound, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, floated through the air. It came from the corner of the room. Her eyes snapped toward it. There was no one there, no one to be seen, but she could feel it, a presence, something close. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "It wasn't supposed to happen. Rhonda stumbled back, clutching the note to her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears. Was this a nightmare? She tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat, frozen with fear. The whispering grew louder now, circling around her. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to happen to you. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller with each passing second. Her head spun, the room spinning with it. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, the note still clutched tightly in her hand. Everything around her became a blur, the whispers now filling the space, drowning her in confusion and terror. And then, just like that, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Rhonda could barely breathe, but something new was creeping in, something far worse than the whispers. A realization, a chilling truth that she couldn't escape. She turned her head slowly, her gaze falling on the reflection in the hallway mirror. The reflection wasn't just her. It was someone else, someone standing behind her. Her body froze, her eyes locked with the image in the glass. She didn't dare turn around, but she knew. The truth was standing right behind her. The air seemed to freeze as Rhonda's gaze remained locked on the mirror. Her reflection was no longer just hers. A shadowy figure stood directly behind her, its outline hazy and distorted, but its presence unmistakable. Her breath hitched. It was tall, almost towering, and although she could see no clear features, there was an oppressive weight to it, an energy that made her skin crawl. Her pulse raced as she slowly, cautiously, turned her head. But there was no one there, only the empty hallway. Her heart thudded in her chest as she faced the mirror once again. The figure was still there, looming over her, almost blending into the shadows, but it was unmistakably real. Her entire body trembled as she backed away from the mirror, her feet stumbling against the floor. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, but she knew this was no dream. This was real. The whispers returned, now softer but more persistent, swirling around her like an unseen wind. Underscore, you never should have come back, underscore. The words sent a cold shiver down her spine, and she could feel her blood running cold. She wanted to scream, but her voice betrayed her. Her throat tightened, constricting with every passing second. The figure in the mirror seemed to grow larger, closer, as if it were inching toward her. Rhonda reached out, her hand trembling as it touched the cool surface of the wall. Her legs gave way again, and she collapsed to the floor, her mind racing for answers that never seemed to come. What was happening? Why couldn't she escape this feeling? The reflection of the figure shifted, moving now as if it were alive, stepping forward closer still. But as Rhonda's eyes widened in terror, she saw something else, something that made her heart stop in her chest. The figure was no longer standing behind her. It was standing beside her, in the reflection. No, it wasn't a reflection at all. It was standing with her. Her own face looked back at her, but now it was twisted, distorted, frozen in an expression of fear she couldn't recognize. Her mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. The room was closing in, the air growing impossibly thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. And then, without warning, a voice, clear and chilling, whispered directly in her ear. Underscore, it's impossible to explain, Rhonda, but you'll understand soon enough. Underscore, her body went numb, as if she were no longer in control. The last thing she saw before the darkness overtook her was her own reflection. Smiling back at her, the darkness engulfed her like a suffocating blanket, pulling her deeper into its grip. Rhonda couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room around her dissolved, the walls fading into an endless void. But then a sharp, sudden shift, like being yanked out of the darkness, brought her back. She gasped for air, her body jolting awake. But she wasn't in the hallway anymore. She was in a different place, a place that felt eerily familiar, yet entirely foreign. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood. The walls, lined with shelves, were packed with dust-covered books, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. The room was dim, lit only by a single, flickering candle in the corner. Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. And then she saw it, an old, faded photograph sitting on a wooden desk. Rhonda's heart skipped a beat. The photo was of her, no doubt about it, but there was something wrong with it. She was standing in front of a house that looked strangely like her own, yet it was different. Older, more worn. The edges of the photograph were frayed, but the most unsettling part was the figure beside her. A man, standing too close, his face obscured by shadow. His hands were gripping her shoulders tightly, almost as if he were holding her in place. Rhonda's breath quickened. This wasn't just a picture from her past. This was a memory she couldn't quite place. Her mind raced, trying to recall the events surrounding that moment. But it was as if the memory had been deliberately erased from her mind. The room felt colder now, the air growing heavier. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached for the photo, her fingers trembling as they brushed against its surface. And then, just as her fingers touched the photo, the candlelight flickered violently. The shadows in the room shifted. The man in the photo seemed to come alive, his features sharpening. His eyes, those eyes, locked onto hers with a piercing, unsettling gaze. Rhonda stumbled back, the photo slipping from her hand and falling to the floor. The man's shadow seemed to stretch across the room, reaching toward her, and for a moment, she thought she saw a smile on his face. A cold, cruel smile. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to vibrate, as if the very fabric of the room was trembling with an energy she couldn't understand. The voice from before, the one that whispered in her ear, echoed again, louder this time, filling the room with a sense of dread. Underscore, you're not safe, Rhonda. You never were. Underscore. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadows moved closer, closing in on her. The man's figure was no longer just a shadow. It was solid real. And he was coming for her. Rhonda's legs trembled, unable to support her as the shadowy figure advanced, its form growing clearer with every step. The air grew colder, biting at her skin like icy fingers. Her heart hammered in her chest, the sound echoing in her ears. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The man's face was now fully visible, a gaunt, hollow visage that seemed to distort with every blink. His eyes glowed with a hollow, unnatural light, like two burning coals set deep in his skull. And his smile, it was unnatural, stretching too wide, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. Rhonda, his voice rasped, deep and gravelly, sending chills down her spine. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to shift, growing darker with each passing second, the walls folding in around her. The very floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the house itself was shifting, warping under the weight of his presence. Why? Why are you doing this? Her voice trembled, barely a whisper, but the man heard it. He chuckled darkly, the sound hollow and cold, like a death rattle. It's too late for questions, Rhonda. You've already crossed the line. His voice was low, menacing, and it made her stomach twist with dread. The shadows around him seemed to stretch and pulse, coiling like snakes, slithering closer. She backed away, instinctively trying to put distance between them, but there was nowhere to go. The room had become a cage. Everything you've forgotten, everything you've suppressed, it's all coming back now. You can't escape it. Not this time. His words were like poison, seeping into her mind, clouding her thoughts. Rhonda's pulse raced as her memories began to flood her consciousness, fragmented and distorted. She saw flashes of the old house again, the one in the photograph. Only now, it was burning, flames licking at the windows. She saw a younger version of herself, running through the smoke, her breath choking on the fumes. She saw the man in the photo, his grip tightening on her shoulder, dragging her into the fire. The memory was a nightmare. One she had tried to bury, one she didn't want to remember. But it was all coming back now, crashing down on her like a wave. No, Rhonda whispered, her voice raw with disbelief. It can't be. The man stepped closer, his eyes glowing with a predatory gleam. You can't outrun the past. You never could. The walls around her seemed to pulse with each word, the room warping, folding into itself. And then, without warning, the man lunged. Rhonda screamed, the sound torn from her throat, but it was too late. His hand, cold, unyielding, grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him with an impossible strength. The shadows twisted around them, consuming everything in their path. Her vision blurred, her body going numb as the man's grip tightened. And just as the darkness closed in completely, one final, horrifying truth shattered her mind. She had always known him. This wasn't the first time she had crossed paths with him. He had been there, lurking in the shadows of her life, waiting for her to remember. The darkness swallowed her whole, and for a moment, Rhonda lost all sense of time and space. She felt as if she were suspended in an endless void, floating between memory and nightmare. Her body went limp, and the shadows around her whispered her name, the sound growing louder, more insistent. Rhonda's mind raced, trying to grasp on anything real, anything familiar. But the more she fought to recall her past, the more fragmented and twisted her memories became. The man's grip on her arm never loosened. His cold fingers dug into her flesh, his presence overwhelming, as though the very fabric of reality itself was being bent and broken around her. "You can't escape me," he murmured, his voice a low growl in her ear. "You can never escape the truth." The words seemed to pierce through her, cutting deeper than anything physical. And then it hit her, the realization she had been avoiding for so long. The truth she'd buried so deep that she couldn't even admit it to herself. The man in front of her wasn't just a shadow from her past. He was a part of it, a twisted, dark part of her own story. Her blood ran cold as the pieces of her fractured memory fell into place. The fire, the house, the scream she couldn't forget, no matter how hard she tried. But now, something new began to form within her, an understanding that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The man wasn't just someone from her past. He was her past. He was the thing she had tried to bury, the thing that had followed her all these years, waiting for her to remember, waiting for her to return. Rhonda's eyes flickered, her mind sharp despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her. She could feel the presence of the man in every corner of the room, his shadow stretching across the walls, his voice ringing in her ears. "You think you can outrun it," he hissed, "but you can't. It's already too late." Her chest tightened with a mixture of panic and anger. Her hand shot out, grabbing at anything in reach, desperate for something to hold on to, something to pull her out of the grip of the shadows. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the desk, and she gripped it tightly. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she fought back. "I won't let you win," Rhonda whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. The man's laugh echoed in the darkness, hollow and mocking. "You don't have a choice." But Rhonda wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for her sanity, for her freedom from the grip of a past that had haunted her for so long. With every ounce of strength she had left, she shoved the desk away, creating a space between herself and the man. The shadows that had once held her in place now seemed to recede, just for a moment. And in that moment, Rhonda bolted. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but she ran as fast as she could, tearing through the room, desperate to escape. The walls, once oppressive and closing in, now seemed to stretch before her, a pathway to something she couldn't quite understand. But the man wasn't far behind. His shadow reached out for her, grabbing at her ankles, pulling her back. She stumbled but didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Rhonda pushed forward, her mind focused on one thing: the door. It was in front of her now, the way out. Her hand shot out, gripping the cold doorknob. With a surge of adrenaline, she yanked it open. And just as the darkness threatened to swallow her again, she stepped through. The cold air outside hit her like a slap in the face. She was no longer in the house, no longer trapped in the twisted nightmare of her past. But as she looked around, Rhonda realized that the nightmare hadn't ended. It had only followed her. And now, she was free. But for how long? Rhonda stood in the cold, the night air biting at her skin, but it wasn't the chill that made her feel as though her body were frozen in place. It was the realization that the shadows had followed her. The house behind her, her old home, now just a silhouette against the moonlit sky, seemed to loom with an unnatural presence. The windows, dark and empty, stared back at her like hollow eyes, watching. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, desperate breaths, but her legs wouldn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But something held her there. The man's presence was still with her. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, in the way the air felt thick and heavy around her. His words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again. Asterisk, you think you can outrun it. It's already too late. Asterisk, the thought made her blood run cold. For a moment, Rhonda closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to hold on to the little clarity she had left. When she opened them again, the world around her seemed different. The street in front of her was no longer the quiet, familiar neighborhood she had known. The houses, the trees, the sidewalks, they were all there, but they were blurred, like a painting left out in the rain. Something was wrong. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and stretch unnaturally. The world around her felt distorted, as though she were trapped between two realities, neither one fully tangible. And then she heard it, a soft rustling behind her, as though someone or something was moving through the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly, her body unwilling to betray her. The house was still there, but now it felt different. The front door was open, and from within, a dim light spilled out, flickering like a flame struggling to stay alive. Her breath caught in her throat. No, She couldn't go back inside. She couldn't. But something pulled her toward it. A pull that felt more like a magnetic force than any choice she could make. Her body, once frozen, began moving on its own, her feet taking her closer to the open door. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper. No, more like a chorus of whispers, all speaking at once. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk, Rhonda's legs gave out, her body collapsing onto the cold ground. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming her senses, drowning her in their presence. She was no longer sure what was real. The man's voice, calm and patient, filled her mind once more. Asterisk, you've always known me. You can't run from me, Rhonda. I am you. Asterisk, her heart raced, a panic she had never known before taking hold of her. And then, with a sudden force, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble, and the house, no longer a place of memories, but of something far darker, began to shift. The walls groaned and cracked, as if the house itself were alive, breathing. From the doorway, a shadow moved, a figure silhouetted against the dim light inside. Rhonda wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. The pull was too strong. Her hand reached out, almost involuntarily, toward the door. And then, just as her fingers brushed the frame, the figure stepped forward. But it wasn't just the man from her past. It was her. The woman standing in front of her, face pale and eyes hollow, was Rhonda Casto. But it wasn't the Rhonda she remembered. This version of herself was twisted, her eyes empty of all emotion, her lips curled in a sadistic smile. You finally see, the other Rhonda whispered, her voice like 1,000 voices layered over one another. Asterisk, it was never about escaping. It was always about coming home. Asterisk. And in that moment, Rhonda understood. The house, the figure, the man, it wasn't just the past she was running from. It was herself. And now, there was no way to escape. The world around Rhonda seemed to collapse, as if the very air was being sucked out of existence. The distorted version of herself, her own reflection, yet so foreign, stood in the doorway, her eyes gleaming with something dark and unsettling. Rhonda's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of the truth pressed down on her. The whispers, the shadows, the fire, the figure, it was all her. Her past, her fears, her mistakes. They were all wrapped into this monstrous, twisted reflection standing before her. Her legs trembled, unable to carry her weight. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the woman who wore her face. The air thickened, and the world seemed to swirl around them. The trees, the sidewalk, the houses, they all blurred as if the very fabric of reality was starting to unravel. The ground beneath Rhonda's feet seemed to shift, the earth pulsating with an unnatural energy, as though something far deeper than just the house was awakening. The figure in front of her smiled. It was the same smile she'd seen before, too wide, too twisted, as if it were carved into the very essence of her being. You've been running for so long, Rhonda, the distorted version of her whispered, stepping closer. Asterisk, but you never really left. You were always here, trapped in your own mind. Asterisk, her mind raced, fighting against the flood of memories and emotions threatening to break through. The fire, the screams, the darkness that had always followed her. Every ounce of fear, guilt, and pain she had buried deep inside was rising to the surface now, overwhelming her. Asterisk, you can't hide anymore. It's time to face the truth. Asterisk, Rhonda backed away, instinctively trying to distance herself from the twisted reflection of herself, but the world around her wouldn't let her go. The shadows stretched, reaching out to hold her, to drag her back into the nightmare. But Rhonda didn't want to go back. She couldn't. The fire, the house, the figure, they all held pieces of her soul, fragments of a life she had tried to forget. But now, in the face of this dark reflection, she realized she couldn't escape it, not without confronting it. Her eyes filled with tears, the weight of her past threatening to crush her. But then, something within her shifted. The fear, the paralysis began to fade. She wasn't just standing in front of a ghost from her past anymore. She was standing in front of herself. The distorted version of Rhonda stepped closer, its smile widening. Asterisk, you'll never be free, Rhonda. You belong to me. Asterisk. Rhonda's heart pounded, but in that moment, something within her snapped. She could feel the truth now, as if it were coursing through her veins. The pain, the guilt, the regret, they were all a part of her, but they didn't define her. She had spent years running, but it was time to face what she had tried to bury. The shadows that clung to her faded, and the distorted reflection of herself faltered, the smile beginning to crack, the figure starting to lose its form. Rhonda took a step forward, her voice trembling but growing stronger. Asterisk, I am not you. Asterisk. The world around her seemed to pulse with energy, and for the first time, she felt like she could breathe. The suffocating grip of the past loosened, the shadows receding into nothingness. The figure before her began to unravel, its edges fading into the darkness. And just like that, it was gone. Rhonda stood in the quiet night, the air now clear and still. The house behind her loomed, but no longer did it hold the same weight. The shadows were gone, and the whispers had stopped. Rhonda's feet carried her away from the house, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. The night was eerily silent now, as if the world itself were holding its breath, watching her every move. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long, shifting shadows on the pavement. It felt like the calm after a storm, the air heavy with the weight of something unsaid, something left unresolved. She kept walking, her footsteps echoing in the empty street, the quiet almost deafening. With every step she took, the pressure in her chest seemed to ease, but the fear lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. She wasn't sure how far she had walked, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not yet. Her mind kept circling back to that moment. The moment when she had faced the twisted reflection of herself. The figure that had smiled the cruel smile. The version of her that had been buried beneath years of fear and regret. But that wasn't all. In that moment, as the shadow faded and the reflection unraveled, she had felt something else. Something unsettling. A feeling that she hadn't truly won. That part of her, the dark, hidden part, wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting. What if she was only running from it again? What if the escape had been a lie, a temporary reprieve from the truth that she could never fully outrun? Rhonda's pace quickened, but the question haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps behind her stopped her in her tracks. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Her breath caught as she turned around. But there was no one there, just the empty street, the streetlights, and the shadows that stretched long and dark. She let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously to herself. It was nothing. She was imagining things, her mind playing tricks on her after everything she had just experienced. But as she turned back to continue walking, she felt it, an unmistakable pressure, a sense of being watched. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and then there was a figure standing at the end of the street, a shadow, barely more than a silhouette in the dim light, watching her. Rhonda's heart skipped a beat, her body frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence suffocating, pulling her gaze toward it like gravity. The night seemed to close in around her, the world growing smaller, as if the streets, the houses, the entire neighborhood were fading into the background, leaving only the figure standing before her. She tried to move, but her legs refused to obey. It was as though the figure held her in place with its gaze. The longer she stared, the more familiar it became. That face, it was her own, but twisted, darker, the reflection that had haunted her in the house. Now it was out here, in the real world, and then the figure spoke. Asterisk, you can't run anymore, Rhonda. Asterisk, the voice, low, haunting, seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating in the air around her, as though the night itself had turned against her. Rhonda opened her mouth to scream, to run, to do anything, but her voice failed her. She couldn't make a sound. The figure began to move toward her, each step deliberate and slow, the shadows falling away to reveal its true form. Her own face, distorted by something sinister, twisted in a mockery of a smile. Asterisk, you're not free. Asterisk. The words echoed, reverberating in her mind, drowning out everything else. And then it happened. The figure reached out, and Rhonda felt something cold, unyielding, wrap around her wrist. A coldness that spread, consuming her, pulling her closer. The world around her blurred again, the street, the houses, the light, all fading into nothingness. She was falling, and this time, there would be no escape. The last thing she heard before everything went black was a whisper, a voice she had heard 1,000 times. Asterisk, you never left. Asterisk. The darkness wrapped around Rhonda like a thick, suffocating blanket. It was all-encompassing, smothering her, and yet it wasn't cold this time. It was hot, burning, searing her skin as though the very air were filled with fire. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps, but she couldn't move. She couldn't escape. The figure's touch lingered on her skin, like a phantom that wouldn't release its grip, its presence more suffocating than ever. Its voice, now low and soft, whispered in her ear, its words curling around her like smoke, tightening with every passing second. Asterisk, you've always been mine, Rhonda. Asterisk. Her mind screamed, but her body refused to react. She was trapped. She was drowning in herself, in her own darkness. Her past, her fears, all of the mistakes and regrets that she had tried to bury. Everything was coming to the surface, clawing its way out, suffocating her in the process. The walls of the room seemed to pulse around her, the very structure of the house distorting, warping as though it, too, was alive and part of this twisted reality. The air was thick, vibrating with a low hum, like the sound of 1,000 voices, all whispering her name. You can't escape what you are, the figure continued, its voice growing louder now, filling the room. Asterisk, you're not free. You never were. Asterisk. Rhonda wanted to scream, to fight, but she couldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, like lead, her body trapped in place by an invisible force. The figure was closer now, its features sharp, its eyes dark and hollow, reflecting her own fear. The smile on its face was twisted and cruel, like a mockery of everything she had ever known. And then, it spoke again, its voice cutting through her mind like a blade. Asterisk, face it, Rhonda. You've been running from me your whole life. Asterisk. Her heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. She had been running from the darkness inside her, from the choices she had made, from the things she had never been able to change. But now, there was nowhere left to hide. I am you, the figure said, its voice colder now, like the chill of death itself. Asterisk, we are one. Asterisk. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over her, pulling her under. The darkness, the fear, the guilt, it was all her. She had been trying to escape from herself for so long, but the truth was unavoidable. It was her own reflection, twisted and distorted, staring back at her in the form of the figure. There was no running, no escaping. It was all part of her. As the figure reached out toward her, Rhonda felt a deep, crushing weight in her chest. Her breath caught, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she could feel the very essence of her soul unraveling. She was losing herself, slipping into the dark abyss that had always been waiting for her. And then, in that instant, the figure's hand touched her face. But instead of coldness, it was warmth. It was as though it had become a part of her. The two of them were one, inseparable. You cannot escape, it whispered. And for the first time, Rhonda understood. She wasn't just facing the darkness of her past. She was becoming it. Her vision blurred, and the room around her began to dissolve, the walls crumbling into nothingness. The figure, now fully merged with her, smiled, and in that smile, Rhonda saw herself. The woman she had always tried to outrun, the one she had never been able to confront. It was her, and it always had been. The last of the house faded into oblivion, and in that moment, Rhonda knew. There was no more running. There was no escape. She had become her own darkness, and the darkness had become her. As the house faded into nothingness, Rhonda stood in the void, her heart quiet now. The storm of her thoughts calmed into a strange acceptance. The world around her had dissolved, leaving her in an endless expanse of nothingness. There were no walls, no floors, no streets to walk on. Just an infinite sea of blackness, stretching endlessly in all directions. But it was calm, still, in some strange way. It was peaceful. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't fighting. She was simply here. The figure, now a part of her, stood beside her in the dark, its presence no longer terrifying. It was not an enemy to be feared. It was a reflection of who she truly was. The choices, the mistakes, the parts of her that she had rejected for so long, all of it had culminated in this moment. She could feel the weight of her past, but it no longer crushed her. It was no longer a monster she had to outrun. It was simply a part of her. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, there was no sense of panic, no sense of dread. Just acceptance. Asterisk, you see now, don't you? Asterisk, the figure whispered beside her, its voice no longer cold or mocking, but almost gentle. Asterisk, you can't separate the light from the dark. They are both you. Asterisk. Rhonda nodded slowly. She understood now. The darkness wasn't a force to be destroyed or defeated. It was woven into the very fabric of who she was, as much a part of her as the light, the hope, the love. All of it was intertwined. Her fears, her regrets, her mistakes were all part of the story that made her whole. And with that understanding, the darkness began to shift. It didn't disappear, but it no longer consumed her. It became something more manageable, something she could live with, not something that controlled her. The space around her began to change, just slightly. Small fragments of light flickered in the distance, like stars appearing in the night sky. It was a sign that things were shifting, changing, evolving. Rhonda wasn't sure where she would go from here, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to run. She wasn't trying to escape herself anymore. And with that quiet realization, she took the first step forward, knowing that whatever awaited her, she could face it, whole, unafraid, and ready to embrace both the light and the dark within her. The void was no longer empty. It was filled with her.